billionaire mocks an older waitress. Her first sentence freezes the entire restaurant. The hush that followed was instant, sharp enough to slice through crystal stemware. Conversations at the rooftop dining hall died mid-word. A fork slipped from someone's fingers and clattered against porcelain. But no one seemed to breathe afterward. Near the sweeping glass windows overlooking the city skyline, two businessmen in tailored suits sat with half-raised wine glasses, their laughter still caught on their lips. Their amusement hadn't reached the waitress standing beside them, a woman in her late 60s, hair neatly pinned, uniform pressed with military precision. The tray she held didn't wobble, despite the sting of humiliation aimed her way. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's video, I want to thank you for choosing to watch my channel when there are so many other creators out there. Once again, I sincerely thank you, and I hope you can support me with a subscription and leave a comment with the number 1 after you finish listening to this story. Thank you very much. Come on, the younger man chuckled, wiping a smirk from his mouth. You serve wine, not wisdom. What would someone like you know about financial strategy? The older waitress lifted her eyes slowly, calm, steady, almost pitying. That look alone made the billionaire's grin falter. Cinematic silence settled over the entire floor. The chandelier lights flickered across polished marble, and the gleaming city behind her formed a halo of cold blue. She stood framed between arrogance and skyline, small, quiet, and suddenly immeasurably powerful. Her voice, when it came, was soft enough to make every patron lean in. Sir, if you diversified your positions as poorly as you hide your contempt, I'm afraid your losses must be catastrophic. The billionaire froze. His glass froze. His breath froze. And for a heartbeat, the entire restaurant followed. That was the moment everything shifted. No one here knew that Margaret Doyle, Maggie to her co-workers, the quiet lady to patrons, had spent decades building a life most people never saw. They didn't know she once taught financial literacy workshops at a community center, or that she managed her late husband's pension through 2 recessions without losing a cent. They didn't know she worked nights because her daughter's medical bills drained every savings she had left. All they saw was a tired, older woman in a red apron, a background character in their polished, expensive world. But tonight, that illusion shattered like thin glass. The billionaire Evan Hartridge, CEO of a firm that made headlines for devouring smaller companies, blinked as if someone had slapped him. His associate stopped breathing altogether. "What did you just say?" Evan asked, voice low, almost dangerous. Maggie didn't flinch. She steadied the tray on her palm, posture perfectly aligned. Elegant, despite the years written in her hands. "I said," she repeated gently, "your financial strategy shows the same pattern as your manners. Impulsive, performative, and painfully short-sighted." Someone near the bar gasped. Another person muttered, "Oh my God." Even the pianist missed a note. Evan leaned back in his chair, as if trying to understand whether she was bluffing or whether he had just underestimated someone catastrophically. "How would you know anything about my strategy?" he demanded. Her answer was a quiet dagger. "Because you talked too loudly on the phone, sir. Last week, while you were bragging about over-leveraging into tech stocks, you mentioned numbers that didn't match today's market behavior. Anyone with experience could see the storm coming." His jaw tightened. "And you think you have experience?" he challenged. She looked at him with the same patient disappointment. A professor reserves for a stubborn student. "I have more experience than you have humility." "Oh." Another collective exhale rippled across the room. For a moment, Evan seemed lost, like he had stepped on a stage expecting applause, but instead faced an audience that had discovered the joke wasn't funny. Maggie shifted the tray, preparing to leave. "If you'd like your wine refreshed, sir, I'll bring another bottle. If you'd like investment advice, you may start by speaking to people rather than at them." She turned, and the billionaire, once so smug, silently watched her walk away, his arrogance crumbling, his pride pierced, and an unfamiliar sense of respect blooming where mockery used to live. The reversal had begun. Maggie walked toward the service station with the same steady grace she had carried for decades. though her pulse trembled beneath her skin like a second heartbeat, urging her to stay calm despite what had just unfolded in front of the entire restaurant. The air behind her still carried the echo of her words, stretching across white tablecloths and crystal glasses, lingering like an unexpected gust that had swept through a room unprepared for any breeze at all. She could feel dozens of eyes on her back, some admiring, some stunned, and a few quietly delighted that someone had finally put a man like Evan Hartridge in his place without raising her voice or losing her dignity. As she set the tray down, her co-worker Jenna hurried over with wide, startled eyes that darted between Maggie and the VIP table, as if trying to piece together what exactly had detonated in the middle of an otherwise predictable shift. Maggie offered a small, dismissive smile, insisting she was fine, though a subtle tremor in her hands betrayed the swirl of adrenaline that still surged beneath her calm exterior. She inhaled carefully, adjusting the collar of her uniform, determined not to let the room see any trace of shaken confidence after delivering the sharpest sentence she had spoken in years. Behind her, Evan remained frozen in his chair, his expensive suit pulling tightly across his broad shoulders as he leaned back with a conflicted expression, suggesting equal parts embarrassment and reluctant fascination. His associate whispered something urgently, perhaps urging him to forget the exchange entirely, yet Evan seemed incapable of moving on, as though Maggie had exposed a crack in the polished armor he wore so confidently in every boardroom he entered. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, let alone by someone who carried no visible power, no wealth, and no social leverage of any kind. The silence around the VIP table stretched long enough for a few nearby guests to exchange quiet glances, each one wondering if the billionaire would retaliate with the cold, calculated cruelty men like him often deployed when their pride was damaged. Evan instead lifted his glass with a slow, deliberate motion, studying the deep red wine as though searching for an explanation hidden somewhere in the swirling liquid. His jaw tightened once more before he placed the glass down, pushed his chair back, and rose to his feet with the careful posture of a man preparing to reclaim control of a situation he had catastrophically underestimated. Maggie noticed him approaching long before he reached the service station, yet she refused to look up, choosing instead to fold clean napkins with meticulous precision, allowing him the burden of initiating whatever confrontation he believed necessary to restore his bruised ego. When he finally stopped a few feet away, the tension between them settled like dust in a sunbeam, quiet but impossible to ignore. His voice, when it came, carried far less arrogance than before, revealing something almost unfamiliar within him, an uncertainty he probably hadn't felt since his earliest days climbing toward the world he now dominated. "I want to understand," he said, keeping his tone low enough to avoid attracting more attention, though the nearest tables leaned subtly closer, hungry for the continuation of the scene. "How someone in your position could analyze my investments with more accuracy than my entire advisory team." Maggie met his gaze, with the steady calm of someone who had endured far greater storms than a billionaire's wounded. Pride, letting her silence weigh on him until he shifted uncomfortably beneath the scrutiny he was unaccustomed to receiving. She finally spoke, her voice firm yet gentle, explaining that years of managing medical bills, pensions, and fluctuating markets had taught her to read numbers as if they were living creatures, revealing their intentions through patterns most people overlooked. Evan listened intently, the initial defensiveness slipping away as he realized she wasn't mocking him now, nor was she seeking dominance. She was simply sharing truth born from experience rather than ego. Her explanation carried the weight of real hardship, shaped by nights balancing paychecks against rising costs, a skill forged outside the sterile comfort of corporate strategy meetings. As her words sank in, Evan's posture softened, revealing cracks in the confident facade he projected so effortlessly, allowing the room to glimpse a man wrestling with the uncomfortable reality that wisdom sometimes lived in places he had never bothered to look. He admitted that he rarely encountered people willing to speak candidly to him, noting with a strained attempt at humor that honesty around him was usually filtered through fear, profit, or ambition. The thought seemed to unsettle him more than he expected, as though Maggie's blunt insight had illuminated a loneliness hiding behind his wealth. Before she could respond, Jenna approached with a hesitant step, glancing nervously between them as she whispered that the manager was watching from across the room, uncertain whether to intervene or let the two finish whatever delicate exchange was unfolding. Maggie nodded, reassuring her coworker with a slight touch on the arm, then turned back to Evan, whose expression had shifted into something more respectful, almost thoughtful, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time, rather than through the lens of status and expectation. With surprising humility, he asked if she would consider reviewing a few of his recent decisions, offering payment with an earnestness that suggested he genuinely valued her perspective rather than seeking to save face. Maggie exhaled slowly, weighing the offer not with greed or flattery but with the tempered wisdom of someone who understood that power, when shaken, often reached outward for stability wherever it could be found. She answered carefully, reminding him that respect must come before any request for guidance, whether financial or personal, because advice meant nothing if the listener refused to treat the speaker as an equal. Evan nodded, his expression shifting once more, as a faint, unfamiliar gratitude flickered across his eyes, hinting at the beginning of a transformation sparked not by force or humiliation, but by the quiet courage of a woman he had dismissed too quickly. As he walked back to his table, the restaurant slowly regained its rhythm, though an invisible thread of curiosity remained stretched between every table and the older waitress who had, with nothing more than honesty and composure, unsettled a billionaire and turned an ordinary evening into the opening act of something far larger than anyone yet understood. Maggie returned to her tiny preparation corner behind the bar, letting the faint hum of refrigeration units and the soft clatter of glassware settle her nerves while she steadied her breath and reminded herself that no single exchange, no matter how dramatic, should pull her away from the discipline and poise she had built over a lifetime. Her hands moved instinctively through familiar routines, wiping down a counter that hardly needed cleaning and stacking linen napkins into neat rectangles, each fold reminding her of the quiet structure she depended on to keep the world from tipping too violently beneath her feet. Although the dining room had slowly resumed its cadence, she could still sense the residue of tension swirling through the air like smoke after a candle is blown out, a faint reminder of how fragile social order becomes when pride collides with unexpected truth. She caught glimpses of patrons whispering behind menus, their curious glances flicking toward her with equal parts admiration and astonishment, as though they had witnessed a rare phenomenon they might recount later at parties to prove they were present. For the moment, a billionaire faltered under the weight of an older woman's unpolished brilliance. Yet beneath the murmurs and the adrenaline, her thoughts shifted toward the quiet world, waiting for her at home, a place far removed from marble floors and glittering chandeliers where bills sat stacked like small monuments to her endurance, and where photographs of her late husband watched over the living room with the solemn stillness of memory. Her apartment, cramped and modest, held the remains of a life built on steady devotion rather than wealth, illuminated by a single warm lamp that flickered each time the old circuit box struggled to decide whether it could handle another night of electricity. She thought of her daughter Elena, whose medical treatments had consumed every spare dollar and every ounce of Maggie's resolve, leaving the older woman constantly balancing hope against the crushing fear that one unexpected expense might unravel everything she fought so hard to maintain. Those long nights spent parsing insurance statements, comparing medication prices, and mapping out budgets had taught her more about financial survival than any corporate seminar ever could, and the realization that Evan had mistaken her experience for ignorance brought only a quiet ache rather than anger. Still, she could not entirely shake the strange, unsettling pull of the moment, when the billionaire had looked at her not with disdain but with a dawning awareness that suggested he saw not merely a server but a woman carrying the weight of decades and refusing to bend under it. The memory lingered in her mind with a confusing mixture of pride and sadness, because while she had spoken truth with unshaken clarity, she knew that the cost of living such truth often came from exhaustion that younger, wealthier people rarely recognized or understood. As she prepared a tray for her next table, Maggie allowed herself a small, private smile at the thought that her late husband, a practical man with gentle humor, would have chuckled to hear how she had startled a billionaire with nothing more than a single sentence spoken with deliberate precision. He had always told her that some people mistake quietness for weakness, never understanding that silence is often the shield of those who have already endured more than others could imagine. She adjusted her glasses and straightened her apron, feeling the familiar ache in her knees that came from working double shifts far beyond the age when most people retired. When Jenna passed by again, she whispered that the manager had been watching closely but seemed torn between reprimanding Maggie for disrupting the VIP table and praising her for handling the situation with unparalleled composure. Maggie simply nodded, unwilling to let the moment inflate into conflict, aware that every job she held, no matter how stressful, was a lifeline she could not afford to jeopardize. The restaurant depended on predictability, and she knew all too well that even harmless drama could ripple into consequences for staff members who lacked the protection enjoyed by wealthy guests. Still, beneath her focus on professionalism, she felt a faint tremor of anticipation, as though something had shifted permanently when Evan approached her with genuine interest instead of condescension. She may not have wanted admiration from someone like him, yet she could not ignore the possibility that her words had set into motion forces she didn't yet understand, forces far larger than a single tense conversation in a room full of strangers, sipping wine priced far beyond her means. She carried a fresh tray toward the opposite end of the dining hall, her steps steady despite the twinge in her ankles, and allowed the rhythmic motion to ground her while the clinking of silverware and low conversations blended into a tapestry of ordinary sounds that formed the backdrop of her nightly life. Beneath the glittering veneer of the restaurant, beneath the pressed linens and polished glass, Maggie held fast to the quiet resolve that had carried her through tragedies and triumphs alike, knowing that survival sometimes required nothing more than the courage to speak truth without trembling. Yet as she passed a reflective panel along the far wall, she caught sight of Evan watching her again, his expression sharpened by something between admiration and contemplation, suggesting that her influence had reached deeper into his mind than she had intended. She looked away quickly, unwilling to unravel the tangled possibilities that gaze implied, and returned to her work with disciplined focus, reminding herself that she wanted no entanglements with men whose worlds were built on fragile towers of wealth and pride. Still, the moment lingered like a shadow following her through the room, hinting that the encounter was far from over, and that her life, carefully balanced on routine and necessity, might soon collide with a future she had never expected, shaped by a billionaire who had finally realized that the strongest people in the room are often the ones nobody notices until they speak. As Maggie moved through the restaurant with practiced precision, she sensed an undercurrent shifting through the air, a subtle tightening of posture among the staff that usually signaled the arrival of someone whose presence carried more weight than ordinary patrons could ever generate. The maitre d', normally composed and elegant, walked with a clipped urgency that betrayed the pressure building behind the scenes, glancing repeatedly toward the elevator doors, as though bracing for a storm only he could hear approaching. Even Jenna, whose cheerfulness rarely wavered, whispered nervously that corporate executives from the restaurant's parent company were rumored to be visiting tonight, perhaps conducting an unannounced evaluation that could determine staffing cuts or promotions. Maggie had lived long enough to recognize the unmistakable rhythm of rising tension, a rhythm that always accompanied powerful people who demanded excellence, not through encouragement, but through fear disguised as sophistication. She adjusted the tray in her hands, while allowing her gaze to trace the shifting energy around the room, noticing how the younger servers straightened their uniforms and brushed non-existent dust from their sleeves, their faces tightening as though preparing for inspection by someone whose opinion mattered far more than it should. Her years of experience told her that rich men rarely traveled alone, and billionaires almost always summoned others who moved in circles even wealthier and more ruthless. The sound of the elevator chimed with a sharp metallic note that cut through the steady hum of the dining hall, turning several heads instantly as two tall men stepped out with the unmistakable confidence of individuals accustomed to being obeyed. Their suits were darker than night, immaculately tailored, and their expressions carried the unyielding precision of executives who viewed every room as a chessboard and every person as a potential liability. The taller one scanned the restaurant with a gaze that lingered a fraction too long on each employee, as though mentally sorting them into categories of competence and expendability. Maggie kept her expression neutral, though her pulse tapped lightly against her ribs when she realized both men headed directly toward Evan's table, confirming that the billionaire's presence had drawn in forces far beyond the scope of ordinary diners. One of the executives leaned down to speak to Evan in a hushed tone that carried the clipped precision of someone delivering urgent news, and Maggie couldn't help noticing the faint spark of annoyance cross Evan's face, an expression suggesting that his moment of introspection had been interrupted by obligations he could not postpone. The tension deepened when Evan gestured subtly toward Maggie, causing both executives to turn and assess her with cool, clinical detachment, as though attempting to reconcile the older woman's modest uniform with whatever explanation Evan had offered moments earlier. Their curiosity was not the warm curiosity of casual interest, but the analytic curiosity of men trying to determine why a waitress had suddenly become relevant in a conversation about business, power, or strategy. Maggie held their gaze without shrinking, knowing that fear only fed the appetites of people who thrived on intimidation. One of the executives stepped closer to Evan, speaking with a tone barely above a whisper, although the intensity in his expression suggested deep concern or urgent disagreement. Evan listened with growing irritation, his jaw tightening as he interrupted more sharply than before, and the associate raised a hand in a placating gesture that revealed the thin line between hierarchy and rebellion. Maggie recognized this dynamic immediately. She had seen it in boardrooms while accompanying her husband to corporate dinners, observing how men with too much pride and too little perspective struggled to agree on who held the final authority. The restaurant staff felt the shift too, with servers moving more cautiously around the VIP table, their eyes flicking nervously between the executives and Evan, as though each misstep might trigger consequences far beyond spilled wine or misplaced cutlery. Maggie sensed that something larger was brewing beneath the surface, perhaps a corporate dispute or a looming financial issue that had brought these executives here unannounced, and for a fleeting moment she wondered whether her blunt remarks earlier had intersected with forces she had never intended to touch. As the executives retreated a step, Evan leaned back in his chair with a contemplative expression, the weight of whatever conversation they had shared settling heavily across his features. He looked toward Maggie again, this time with a depth of thought that carried not just curiosity but a quiet desperation, as though her unexpected insight had opened a door he now needed to walk through before everything around him collapsed. She continued wiping the counter with deliberate, patient movements, silently reassuring herself that staying grounded was the safest way to survive a shift that seemed increasingly unpredictable. The executives eventually signaled for a private space, and the maitre d' rushed to accommodate them, his voice trembling slightly as he led them toward a secluded alcove away from the main dining floor. Before following, Evan paused, glanced once more toward Maggie, and then made a decision visible only in the faint tightening of his jaw, a decision that told her their interaction was far from over and that he intended to pursue the truth behind her quiet intelligence. For the first time that evening, Maggie felt the weight of something shifting far beyond the walls of the restaurant, as though the storm clouds gathering above the skyline were mirroring the rising tension within the dining hall. She steadied herself with a deep breath, reminding her tired heart that she had navigated harder nights and heavier burdens. But even so, she could not deny the unmistakable sensation that the powerful forces now converging around Evan would eventually pull her into their orbit, whether she welcomed the intrusion or not. The tension rolling across the dining hall deepened as the executives disappeared into the private alcove, leaving a vacuum of unease behind them that seemed to cling to every surface like a thin layer of dust no one could quite brush away. Maggie returned to polishing the silverware, though her eyes subtly traced the uneasy glances exchanged among the staff, each one carrying the same silent question about what exactly had brought high-ranking decision-makers into the restaurant on an unannounced night. Her instincts, sharpened by age and years of watching powerful people move like storms through quiet rooms, told her that something inside Evan's world had begun unraveling long before she uttered her pointed sentence. The maitre d' visibly rattled, stepped quickly from table to table, offering overly rehearsed pleasantries to diners who barely acknowledged him, their attention fixed more on the dramatic shifts brewing around the VIP section than on the artisanal dishes resting elegantly before them. He paused near Maggie with a look so strained it seemed his nerves were being stretched beyond what his stiff collar could contain, and she sensed before he even spoke that he was about to deliver an instruction that would only complicate her evening further. He cleared his throat quietly, adjusting his tie with trembling fingers, as if hoping the gesture might somehow restore the control slipping through his grasp. "Maggie," he said in a low voice, burdened with apology, "I need you to take over service for Mr. Hartridge's table again, at least until the situation stabilizes, because the others are feeling too intimidated to approach them right now." His eyes shifted toward two younger servers who stood frozen near the wine station, their faces pale with the unmistakable dread of staff members, terrified of disappointing guests whose influence stretched far beyond restaurant walls. Maggie recognized that look instantly. It was the same one she'd seen decades ago when younger colleagues hid behind her during confrontations with arrogant patrons who believed their wealth entitled them to cruelty. She inhaled slowly, allowing the breath to steady her before she nodded, with the quiet acceptance of someone who had learned long ago that duty often demanded resilience rather than comfort. As she walked toward the VIP table, she felt the eyes of every server follow her, their expressions mixing gratitude with guilt, knowing she was stepping into a storm none of them dared navigate. The clinking of glasses, once rhythmic and soothing, now echoed like distant thunder, each sound amplifying the tension settling thickly over the room. When she reached the edge of Evan's table, she paused only long enough to compose herself before stepping forward with the dignified calm that had defined her for years. Evan looked up immediately, his expression still clouded by whatever discussion had taken place in the alcove, yet softened by the memory of her earlier insight, as though her presence offered a clarity he desperately needed, but could not openly request. His associate, however, stiffened when she approached, clearly still unsettled by the unexpected authority in her earlier remarks, and his eyes narrowed slightly with suspicion, as if trying to determine whether she was a threat or a temporary anomaly he could safely ignore. Maggie folded her hands gently, offering the practiced warmth of a seasoned professional, while ensuring her gaze neither challenged nor cowered, creating the delicate balance required to serve without submission. "Would you like anything refreshed, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice carrying the calm steadiness of someone accustomed to easing tensions without ever acknowledging them aloud. Evan studied her for a long moment before replying, his tone quieter than before, touched by a fatigue that hinted at conflicts far beyond the walls of the dining hall. He requested another bottle of their preferred red, adding a polite "please" that startled his associate enough to prompt a double-take, revealing just how unusual such courtesy was for a man accustomed to command rather than conversation. As Maggie reached for the bottle, the associate leaned closer to Evan and whispered urgently, clearly unaware that Maggie's years of experience had trained her to catch subtle tones even when words blurred together. There was something in the rhythm of his voice, sharp, anxious, purposeful, that suggested the executive's visit had delivered unwelcome news, perhaps regarding financial instability or internal betrayal. Evan's expression remained composed, though his knuckles tightened around the edge of the table, betraying the strain he tried so carefully to conceal. While she opened the bottle with deliberate precision, Maggie felt the weight of the moment settle around her like a veil, signaling that this was no longer a simple evening of serving drinks and managing tensions, but rather the beginning of a complicated entanglement she had never asked to enter. She poured the wine with steady hands, her movements smooth and unbroken, even as her intuition whispered that her earlier comment about future losses had not been a coincidence, but instead a mirror reflecting deeper troubles Evan's team was now scrambling to contain. As she finished pouring, Evan offered a small nod of gratitude, a gesture so subtle it almost disappeared beneath the table's white linen, yet significant enough to confirm that her presence, once dismissed, had now become an anchor in a situation threatening to spiral beyond his control. The associate, still skeptical, muttered something about timing and unfavorable market indicators, and although the words were fragmented, they carried enough weight to reveal that Evan's empire was facing an impending blow he had not anticipated. Maggie sensed she was standing at the edge of a moment that would soon pull her into the center of a world she never intended to revisit, yet her steady composure did not waver, because she understood that when powerful men falter, they often reach instinctively for the person who speaks truth with clarity rather than fear. She stepped back from the table with the same poised grace she carried into every room she entered, unaware that the simple act of accepting this reassigned service had just tethered her fate more tightly to Evan Hartridge's collapsing world than either of them yet understood. As Maggie stepped away from the VIP table, she felt the shifting weight of unspoken tension clinging to her shoulders like a heavy shawl, woven from equal parts unease and reluctant responsibility, because despite her attempts to return to the quiet rhythm of her duties, she sensed that the storm brewing around Evan Hartridge was tightening its circle in ways she could neither ignore nor fully comprehend. She crossed the dining hall with slow, measured steps, trying to slip back into the anonymity that usually shielded her from the unpredictable whims of powerful men. Yet something in the air had changed irreversibly, marking her as a figure no longer invisible to those accustomed to looking past people like her. The younger servers watched her with a mixture of awe and trepidation, whispering hurried questions behind the bar about how she had managed to speak so boldly without trembling, as though she possessed some secret immunity to the sharp edges of wealth and arrogance. Maggie, who had spent decades surviving disappointments far more painful than condescension, simply gave them a gentle nod before returning to the task of restocking glasses, reminding herself that humility required neither silence nor submission. Beneath her calm exterior, however, she sensed the growing awareness that Evan's interest in her earlier remarks had unsettled the delicate balance of the night, pulling her into the path of a man wrestling with issues that extended far beyond a simple misjudgment of character. Her quiet work was interrupted when she noticed Evan rising slowly from his chair, dusting his palm across his suit in a gesture loaded with practiced casualness that nevertheless failed to conceal the anxious stiffness in his movements. His associate attempted to discourage him with a subtle shake of the head, but Evan brushed the warning aside, compelled by something he seemed unwilling to name yet unable to ignore. He approached Maggie with the hesitant stride of a man balancing pride and desperation, as though he wanted to appear composed but had lost the ground beneath his confidence. When he reached her, he tried to smile, a strained, uneven attempt at nonchalance, but the uncertainty in his eyes betrayed the turmoil swirling beneath the surface of his polished demeanor. He rested one hand lightly on the counter, pretending to study the arrangement of wine glasses before speaking in a tone meant to sound casual, though the slight tremor in his voice revealed his deeper motives. "Tell me something," he said, lowering his gaze until it rested on her with unsettling intensity. "Do you actually believe what you said earlier, or were you simply trying to embarrass me in front of the room?" Maggie lifted her eyes slowly, choosing her words with careful restraint, understanding that men like Evan often cloaked insecurity with a veneer of arrogance designed to conceal their vulnerability. She answered with quiet clarity, reminding him that truth spoken without malice deserved respect rather than suspicion, especially when spoken by someone with nothing to gain from the exchange. Her answer, rather than soothing him, seemed to strike an exposed nerve, prompting Evan to lean a little closer, lowering his voice into a sharper, more defensive cadence that revealed the sting of a man unaccustomed to being corrected. "And what exactly makes you think you understand anything about my financial decisions?" he asked, this time allowing the edge of challenge to sharpen his words. "Do you actually follow the markets? Or were you just repeating something you overheard without understanding its context?" The subtle sneer shaping his final question carried the unmistakable tone of someone attempting to reclaim power by minimizing another's intelligence, a pattern Maggie had witnessed countless times from men who feared being seen as anything less than infallible. His words hung between them like a suspended blade, crafted not from cruelty but from the instinctive need to reassert dominance. She took a slow breath before responding, refusing to let his tone drag her into defensiveness, because she recognized that his question was less about her competence and more about his struggle to reconcile the truth she had delivered with the image he maintained of himself. Her reply, calm and steady, explained that following the markets was not a hobby for her but a necessity forged by years of financial hardship, medical expenses, and the relentless discipline required to keep her family afloat despite forces constantly threatening to pull them underwater. She reminded him that experience gained through survival carried its own form of authority, one that could not be purchased, inherited, or delegated. His expression faltered, though only for a moment, before he attempted a strained chuckle that lacked its usual confidence. "Then humor me," he said, leaning against the counter with false ease. "If you're so confident in your instincts, tell me, what mistake do you think I'm making right now?" The challenge, framed as a casual inquiry, was carefully crafted to corner her, forcing her to either step back from her earlier statements or risk exposing the depth of her insight in a room filled with people who would not understand the stakes at play. Maggie met his gaze without flinching, weighing his question with the seriousness it deserved, aware that her answer could either settle the tension or ignite it into something far more consequential. She spoke slowly, outlining the signs she had observed: the agitation of his executives, the hurried whispers, the market indicators she recognized from snippets of conversation drifting across the dining hall, and gently but firmly, he explained that fear disguised as urgency usually meant something far more fragile than confidence was holding his empire together tonight. Her words stopped him mid-breath, freezing him once more in the same unmistakable stillness that had rippled through the restaurant earlier, though this time the silence felt heavier, tinged with the weight of truth he could no longer dismiss. For a moment he said nothing, gripping the edge of the counter as though steadying himself against a sudden gust of cold wind. And in that stillness, Maggie understood that her insight had pierced far deeper than any insult ever could, because she wasn't mocking him now. She was revealing the vulnerability he had spent a lifetime hiding. And in that revelation, the shift of power between them became undeniable, not through force or humiliation, but through the quiet authority of a woman who saw clearly what he desperately wanted to obscure. The echo of Maggie's quiet observation hung in the air like a suspended bell tone, shimmering through the space between her and Evan with an intensity that made the chandelier lights feel suddenly colder, as though even the glass understood the gravity of what she had hinted at so calmly. Evan's grip on the counter tightened almost imperceptibly, betraying the tension coiling beneath his expensive suit, and for a moment he seemed unable to decide whether to confront her bluntness or retreat behind the familiar armor of practiced arrogance that usually shielded him from discomfort. His associate watched from the table with a rigid posture that suggested he was bracing for an outburst, yet even he seemed acutely aware that something deeper was unfolding, something raw, unfiltered, and inconvenient. Maggie felt the weight of his stare pressing against her composure, but she held it without wavering, understanding instinctively that stepping back now would only give him permission to dismiss the truth she had already spoken with unwavering clarity. She turned slightly, placing the polished wine key on the counter, letting the faint click break the silence before she spoke again with the steady cadence of someone accustomed to delivering difficult truths without ceremony or apology. Her voice carried a softness that sharpened the impact of her words, making them feel less like accusations and more like simple statements of reality constructed from observation, experience, and instinct. "You're not worried about the market," she said, letting each syllable settle in a deliberate rhythm. "You're worried about what your people aren't telling you, which is always a much bigger problem than any fluctuation on a chart." The statement drifted across the dining hall with a quiet force that made several nearby guests pause mid-conversation, their attention drawn not by volume, but by the unmistakable tension radiating from the VIP corner. Evan blinked twice, stunned not by the content of her words, but by how precisely she had identified the fear he had tried to conceal beneath feigned confidence. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as though afraid that even the walls might repeat the truth she had uncovered, revealing the vulnerability he worked so hard to hide. "What makes you think they're withholding anything?" he asked, attempting firmness, though the crack threading through his tone betrayed uncertainty he could no longer disguise. His question trembled with an anxious edge, the kind that revealed he already suspected the answer but needed someone fearless enough to confirm it. Maggie studied him calmly, reading not only the unease etched across his expression but the exhaustion hiding behind his poised exterior, as if he had spent years pretending strength he no longer possessed. She answered with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades navigating crises without the safety nets wealth provided, drawing from the intuitive understanding that people reveal more through what they don't say than through any polished explanation they offer. "Because men who control too much money never panic over numbers alone," she said, her voice strong yet gentle. "They panic when loyalty starts to crack, and tonight you're surrounded by cracks no one wants to acknowledge." Her words struck him like a shock of cold air, freezing him in place with the unmistakable stillness of a man facing an unwelcome truth he had spent too long avoiding. For a moment, Evan's breath hitched, barely noticeable, yet revealing enough to break the careful facade he wore as naturally as his tailored suit. His associate shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing between them with growing concern, clearly aware that Maggie's insight had pierced far deeper than expected. A few diners nearby pretended to focus on their meals, though their subtle, lingering glances betrayed their fascination with the unfolding drama in the corner of the room. Evan tried to swallow the rising discomfort, but the effort only emphasized the tension building across his features, sharpening the line of his jaw and tightening the muscles in his neck. He forced a faint, brittle laugh that cracked at the edges, exposing the fragility beneath it. "You talk like someone who's familiar with betrayal," he said cautiously, as though probing for a weakness he hoped might offset the vulnerability she had revealed in him. Maggie's eyes softened for a brief moment, touched by memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit, though her voice remained steady when she replied. "Anyone who has lived long enough understands it," she said, choosing not to elaborate on the deeper scars buried beneath her calm exterior, because wisdom earned through hardship rarely needed explanation. Her restraint only deepened Evan's unease, as though he sensed that she carried a history richer and more complex than the servers and associates who surrounded him, all of whom bowed instinctively to his authority without offering anything resembling challenge or truth. As silence stretched between them again, a faint tremor rippled across the dining hall when one of the executives re-emerged from the alcove, his expression tight with frustration as he signaled urgently for Evan to return. The urgency in his gesture revealed that something had shifted behind closed doors, something serious enough to demand the billionaire's immediate attention, and Evan straightened slightly, torn between the pressing demands of his collapsing business and the unsettling clarity Maggie continued to offer without expectation or deference. Before he stepped away, he looked at her with an intensity that carried equal parts desperation and dawning respect, as though he had realized that the one person capable of navigating the truth he faced was the woman he had underestimated so profoundly only hours earlier. "Don't go far," he murmured softly, surprising even himself with the request. "I might need your perspective again sooner than I expected." The confession hovered between them like a fragile thread, weaving together the remnants of pride, humility, and unspoken fear. Maggie nodded with quiet composure, offering neither reassurance nor refusal, aware that his need for stability was growing by the minute and that her presence, however unintentional, had become a grounding force in a world threatening to spiral beyond his control. As he walked away, the realization settled deeply within her that the power dynamic between them had been irreversibly altered, not through wealth or authority, but through truth spoken with calm certainty, leaving him frozen once more beneath the weight of everything she had revealed. When Evan disappeared behind the frosted glass doors with his executives, Maggie allowed herself a long, controlled breath, trying to steady the restless pulse beating beneath her steady exterior, because the air around her still vibrated with the shock of everything she had revealed and everything he had silently admitted through the haunted look lingering in his eyes. She returned to arranging a row of dessert plates with the meticulous attention of someone who understood that order, even in small rituals, could anchor a person during moments when life threatened to collapse under the weight of uncertainty. Yet despite her efforts to focus on her tasks, she felt an undeniable awareness simmering beneath her calm facade, a strange, magnetic pull formed from the way Evan kept returning to her, seeking answers he could not find within the polished corridors of his own empire. The other servers continued glancing at her in quiet disbelief, still replaying the earlier exchange, as though trying to decipher how an older woman, in a simple uniform, had effortlessly disarmed a billionaire whose presence usually commanded entire rooms into silence. Their awe made her uneasy, because she had spent years cultivating invisibility as a shield, understanding that attention, especially from powerful men, often carried consequences she could neither predict nor control. Now, however, that invisibility had been pierced irreversibly, leaving her exposed in ways she had never intended, forced into the center of a narrative that did not belong to her. As she delivered a plate to table 9, the pianist shifted into a slow jazz progression that blended elegantly with the gentle murmur of conversations around the dining hall, though even the music seemed to pause momentarily when the executives reemerged, their stern faces overshadowed by the unmistakable tension of men grappling with bad news. They gestured sharply for Evan to follow, but he surprised them by raising a hand and signaling for a brief moment alone, a gesture that made the taller executive tighten his jaw, as though suppressing an argument he knew he wouldn't win. Instead of heading directly toward the alcove, Evan walked back to Maggie with a purpose that felt both unsettling and strangely earnest, as though he were drawn not by pride, but by a growing need for clarity he could no longer suppress. His footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor, and when he stopped beside her, he stood a fraction closer than politeness required, creating a small pocket of quiet between them that pressed against her like a subtle gravitational pull. His expression, though still shadowed by strain, held a depth of curiosity shaped not by skepticism, but by a dawning respect that softened the sharp edges of his otherwise imposing demeanor. "I need you to be honest with me," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, yet firm enough to carry the weight of everything he was unwilling to admit aloud. "When you look at me, or rather at the mess behind me, can you actually tell what's going to happen next? Or am I imagining the precision in your words?" His question, layered beneath desperation and fragile hope, pressed into her like a hand reaching through fog, searching for something steady in a world growing increasingly unstable. Maggie placed the dessert fork beside the plate with deliberate care before turning fully toward him, allowing her gaze to meet his without fear or hesitation. She answered slowly, explaining that patterns were often more revealing than numbers, and that the behavior of the people surrounding him spoke louder than any financial report he might pretend to trust. Her voice carried a quiet weight, reminding him that experience forged from hardship held an accuracy money could never replicate, especially when navigating uncertainty rooted not in market errors but in human dishonesty. Evan listened with an intensity that made the air between them feel charged, as though her words were stripping away illusions he had spent years building. The vulnerability shaping his features grew more pronounced the longer she spoke, betraying a man who had led his empire with confidence, yet spent too long ignoring the warning signs blooming quietly at its foundation. When she finished, he exhaled slowly, as though releasing a burden he had carried far too long, and his gratitude shimmered through his expression with an authenticity that startled even him. "You speak like someone who has seen through people her entire life," he said quietly, his voice dipping into a tone that carried both admiration and something dangerously close to reverence. "And I don't understand why your clarity feels so necessary right now." His confession lingered between them like a fragile thread, weaving uninvited complexity into the space where their worlds momentarily overlapped. Maggie stepped back slightly, maintaining the boundary she knew she needed to protect, because the last thing she wanted was to be drawn into the private storms of a man whose life operated in spheres far beyond her own. She reminded him gently that she was simply doing her job and offering honesty where it was needed, refusing to let him elevate her insight into something mystical or extraordinary. Her refusal seemed to deepen his fascination, not diminish it, as though her humility itself was the trait that challenged him most. Before he could respond, the taller executive reappeared with a sharp clearing of his throat, signaling that whatever crisis simmered behind the scenes could no longer wait for personal revelations or philosophical conversations. Evan glanced briefly toward the alcove before returning his gaze to Maggie with a final conflicted look, a silent acknowledgement that he was being pulled in two directions, one by duty and one by the unexpected steadiness she offered. "Don't disappear," he said quietly, almost pleadingly. "I need someone who isn't afraid to tell me the truth." She nodded once, neither encouraging nor rejecting his request, holding her ground with the calm dignity she had carried throughout the night. As he stepped away, she felt a tug in her chest, not attachment, but recognition, because she understood that in the world of powerful men, truth was often a rare currency, and she had inadvertently become its sole source in a room filled with polished lies. And deep down, beneath her practiced composure, she sensed that this strange, fragile connection forming between them was no accident, but rather the prelude to a greater unraveling neither of them was prepared to face. When Evan finally allowed the executives to shepherd him into the private alcove, Maggie watched the glass doors close behind them with a quiet heaviness, sensing instinctively that whatever emerged from that room would not resemble the confident, untouchable figure he had embodied at the beginning of the night. She turned back to her duties with deliberate composure, yet the tension humming beneath the restaurant's polished veneer continued to thicken, settling like fog against the warm glow of the chandeliers and forcing even the most oblivious patrons to lower their voices in uneasy curiosity. Despite her attempt to retreat into routine, the weight of her earlier words pressed gently at her thoughts, whispering that she had spoken with a precision she would not be able to take back, regardless of the consequences waiting on the other side of that frosted glass. Inside the alcove, muffled voices rose in sharp-clipped cadences that signaled escalating conflict, and Maggie could distinguish enough tonal shifts to understand that accusations were being exchanged with increasing urgency. She noticed Jenna pausing mid-stride to glance toward the doors, her expression twisting with concern, while two busboys whispered nervously about rumors of a failing merger connected to Evan's company. Their words drifted through the air like loose papers caught in a draft, carrying hints of panic that revealed cracks far deeper than a simple miscommunication within high-level staff. As Maggie arranged a fresh tray of water carafes, the executives' voices spilled more clearly into the dining hall, one of them speaking with a frustrated edge that suggested not just financial trouble but a betrayal involving someone high in the chain of command. She recognized the rhythm immediately because it mirrored countless conversations she'd overheard years earlier when her husband struggled with corrupt partners who nearly destroyed the community center they had poured their lives into. The familiarity of that tone, the brittle mix of disbelief and rage, made her stomach tighten as though old wounds had stirred awake beneath the surface of her calm exterior. Minutes passed with slow, heavy tension until the doors burst open abruptly, and the associate who had been seated with Evan emerged with a pale, strained expression that revealed more than he likely intended. He walked quickly toward the restroom, muttering incoherently under his breath, while the executives followed behind him with grim determination, their faces etched with the hollow weariness of men confronting unpleasant truths they could no longer conceal. When Evan finally stepped out afterward, he looked not just troubled but shaken, as though the ground beneath his carefully curated life had cracked so violently he could not yet comprehend the magnitude of the damage. He paused near the entrance of the alcove, running a hand through his hair with a slow, unsteady movement that betrayed the unraveling of the persona he had worn so confidently just hours earlier. The billionaire who returned from that room did not resemble a man accustomed to power. He resembled someone realizing, perhaps for the first time, that all the influence in the world could not protect him from the consequences of misplaced trust. His gaze swept the dining hall until it found Maggie again, and something in his expression softened not out of dependence, but out of a dawning recognition that clarity sometimes came from the most unexpected sources. He approached her slowly, each step measured and heavy, as though he feared that hurrying might expose the fragility of the composure he was desperately trying to maintain. When he stopped in front of her, the bustling restaurant seemed to fade into a distant hum, leaving only the two of them suspended within a pocket of charged quiet that neither had intended to create. "You were right," he said finally, his voice roughened by the weight of the admission. "It isn't the market I should be worried about. It's the people I trusted, people who apparently decided that my downfall would be more profitable than my success." Maggie felt the familiar ache of empathy stir within her, because betrayal, regardless of wealth or status, carved the same wounds in every heart it touched, slicing through pride with the same merciless precision. She responded gently, reminding him that betrayal rarely announced itself with fanfare. It crept quietly through complacency, feeding on blind confidence, until it struck with surgical cruelty. Her words, delivered with the same steady calm she had maintained throughout the evening, seemed to steady him more effectively than any reassurance from his executives, because her honesty lacked agenda, strategy, or emotional manipulation. Evan exhaled slowly, resting one hand against the counter, as though grounding himself against the rising tide of uncertainty, threatening to swallow him whole. "I don't understand how you saw it before I did," he murmured, his voice trembling slightly with bewildered disbelief. "My team highly paid specialists completely missed it, and yet you recognized the signs within minutes." Maggie shook her head gently, explaining that she had not analyzed spreadsheets or financial projections, but merely observed human behavior with the clarity of someone who had learned to read unspoken truths long before she ever learned to read numbers. Before she could continue, the taller executive called sharply from across the room, signaling that urgent decisions had to be made immediately, likely ones with consequences that would ripple far beyond the restaurant's polished floors. Evan hesitated, torn between duty and the strange, unexpected anchor Maggie had become, but finally straightened his shoulders and prepared to return to the gathering storm. "Please don't leave yet," he said quietly, the sincerity in his tone carrying far more weight than any command he had ever issued. "When I walk back out of that room, I might need someone grounded enough to tell me the truth again." "Oh." Maggie nodded with composed restraint, her eyes softening only enough to acknowledge the vulnerability he had allowed her to glimpse. As he turned away, she watched him cross the dining hall with a gait that no longer carried the sharp precision of power, but instead reflected the heavy burden of a man confronting the collapse of everything he thought immovable. And in that moment, she realized with quiet certainty that the balance of power between them had shifted once more not toward dominance or submission, but toward an uncomfortable interdependence neither of them had sought, yet both seemed unable to escape. When Evan disappeared once more behind the alcove doors, Maggie felt a familiar weight settle across her chest, not from fear or exhaustion, but from the quiet anticipation that always accompanied memories she preferred to leave undisturbed. She collected a small stack of dessert menus from the hostess stand, though her hands moved more slowly than usual, as though her body recognized the approaching shift in the evening's emotional current before her mind fully understood it. The dining hall remained dim and elegant, but the tension had thickened into something far more personal, stretching between her and the billionaire with a subtle gravity that neither status nor strength could negate. As she moved toward a waiting table, her thoughts drifted unwillingly toward the years that had shaped her. Years filled with battles that demanded far more resilience than anything this restaurant or its wealthy patrons could ever ask of her. She remembered the nights she spent at the kitchen table with her husband, sorting through overdue bills and medical reports, trying to stitch together hope from numbers that refused to bend, and she recalled the heartbreaking moment when she realized she would have to face the world alone after he passed, carrying burdens too heavy for someone her age. These memories had carved the quiet strength in her voice, the precision in her observations, and the calm she now wielded like armor. Though she never discussed her past with coworkers, the truth lingered behind everything she did that she had once been married to a man who believed deeply in community education, and together they had built financial literacy workshops for families struggling to manage rising debt and confusing loan structures. She had spent years assisting him, creating simplified lessons and teaching mothers, fathers, and retirees how to protect themselves from predatory lenders and volatile markets. Their work had saved dozens of families from losing homes or retirement funds, but it had also drawn unwanted attention from powerful individuals who profited from the confusion of others. She remembered too clearly the night a corrupt financial advisor retaliated against her husband for exposing his unethical practices, launching a smear campaign that ruined their funding and left them scrambling to keep their program alive. The betrayal shattered everything they had worked for, pushing them into a fight they were too exhausted to win, and when her husband's health declined shortly afterward, the battle became impossible to continue. She closed the workshop doors the same week she checked him into hospice care, and after he passed, she stepped into the first job she could find, the restaurant, because survival rarely waited for grief to subside. As these memories flooded her mind, she steadied herself with a deep breath, reminding her heart that the past was not a wound but a well of strength, one she had drawn from quietly for years, without requiring acknowledgement or validation. Yet tonight, for reasons she could not entirely explain, she sensed the past rising not to haunt her, but to shape the path she was now walking beside a man whose life was unraveling in ways she recognized intimately. When Evan re-emerged from the alcove, he looked older not in years but in the weary heaviness that formed between his eyebrows, the kind that appears only after a person finally understands that trust can fracture without warning. He approached her slowly, with the deliberate steps of someone bracing for a truth he knew he needed but feared hearing. His executives remained behind, watching through the glass with expressions trapped between irritation and disbelief, as though they resented the gravity Maggie had unexpectedly gained in his world. He stopped a few feet from her, studying her with an expression that blended curiosity, respect, and a subtle desperation that made him seem far more human than the sharply dressed figure who had first walked into the restaurant hours earlier. "You see things most people don't," he said quietly, voice carrying the weight of a man humbled by circumstances he could not control. "You speak with a certainty that isn't guesswork, and I need to understand where that comes from. How do you know the signs of betrayal so well?" Maggie considered remaining silent, protective of the parts of her life she kept tucked behind years of practiced privacy. But something in Evan's expression, something raw and searching, made her reconsider. She spoke slowly, her voice steady but softened by the ache of memory, explaining that she had once worked with her husband to help vulnerable families navigate financial instability and avoid the traps laid by predatory advisors. She described the workshops, the late nights studying market shifts, and the painful unraveling of their efforts when someone they trusted chose greed over integrity, shattering not only their program, but the faith they had placed in their community. Evan listened with an intensity that stripped away the last remnants of arrogance, his breath catching slightly at the realization that her insights had been forged through hardship rather than academic theory or idle speculation. When she mentioned her husband's illness, his posture softened further, as though the grief woven through her words had reached through his own turmoil and touched something fragile within him. She did not share every detail. Some memories were sacred, but she revealed enough for him to understand that her clarity came not from study alone, but from the resilience earned only through surviving heartbreak, betrayal, and the relentless demands of life. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, the sincerity in his voice resonating with a depth she had not anticipated. "You've endured more than most people ever should, and yet you're still standing here offering truth when you could have walked away." His admission carried a vulnerability she knew he rarely extended to anyone, and it lingered between them like a softening of the evening's sharpest edges. Maggie responded with gentle honesty, reminding him that hardship was not a badge but a teacher, and that survival often required learning to see through people rather than words. Her perspective, she told him, was not extraordinary, merely earned over time, but Evan shook his head slightly. His gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that revealed how profoundly her story had unsettled and grounded him. In that moment, with the city lights glittering behind them and the storm swirling through the alcove threatening to dismantle his empire, Evan realized something quietly monumental. The woman he had underestimated, mocked, and dismissed possessed a strength he had never encountered among the polished strategists and advisors who surrounded him daily, and for the first time in years, he felt the rare, disorienting sensation of humility, taking root inside him not as humiliation, but as awakening. Evan stood before Maggie with a stillness that felt strangely reverent, as though her story had rearranged something deep inside him, loosening the tightly wound threads of pride that had held him together for so long and revealing a quieter, humbler core he rarely allowed anyone to witness. The dining hall glowed in soft amber light, but even the chandeliers seemed dimmer than the raw honesty settling between them, casting a gentler warmth across the crease, forming between his brows an expression shaped not by anger or defensiveness, but by genuine self-reflection. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words emerging slowly, like a confession that required effort he wasn't accustomed to giving. "Not just for the way I spoke earlier, but for assuming I understood your worth before you even opened your mouth." His gaze flickered briefly toward the VIP table where the executives waited with visible impatience, yet he didn't move toward them. Instead, he stayed anchored to the quiet gravity of the woman who had dismantled his arrogance with nothing more than truth spoken in a steady, measured tone. Maggie absorbed his apology with the composed grace of someone who had weathered countless storms, though her eyes softened slightly at the sincerity threading through his voice, because it wasn't often that men like Evan admitted wrongdoing, especially not in public, and certainly not to someone who stood outside their sphere of influence. She gave a small nod, neither dismissing nor diminishing his words, allowing him the dignity of the humility he was struggling to embrace. He continued, his voice lower now, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might cause the fragile balance between them to shatter. "Tonight has shown me something I should have learned a long time ago," he said, "that people who look like they have nothing to offer often see the truth more clearly than those surrounded by power, numbers, and noise." The admission carried a vulnerability that unsettled him, because he was a man accustomed to absolute control. Yet here he was, standing in front of a woman he had mocked, seeking not forgiveness alone, but understanding. Maggie listened with a steady presence, noticing how his shoulders sloped slightly, as though letting go of pride had physically lightened the weight pressing against him. She sensed that the revelation stirring within him extended beyond their conversation, reaching into the foundations of his life and forcing him to reconsider the values he had built his empire upon. Her voice softened when she finally replied, reminding him that humility was not a weakness but a form of clarity many people spent their entire lives avoiding. Her words seemed to anchor him, offering a rare moment of peace amid the chaos threatening to swallow his business, and he exhaled slowly, as though he had been holding his breath since the moment the executives delivered their devastating news. He looked at her with an intensity that felt different from earlier, less searching, more grounded, like a man finally seeing through the fog of his own ego and recognizing the humanity in someone he had previously overlooked. "I need your help," he said quietly, the admission trembling with equal parts desperation and sincerity. "Not as an advisor, not as an employee, but as someone who sees clearly when others don't. Someone who isn't afraid of power because she's already survived harder battles." The request lingered between them with a weight that felt almost ceremonial, as though he were offering her a place at a table he rarely shared with anyone who wasn't driven by profit or ambition. Before she could respond, he pressed on, his voice thickening with urgency. "My team is falling apart, my shareholders are probably panicking already, and the people I trusted most may have put knives in my back. But you—" He paused, searching her face with a mixture of respect and quiet awe. "You named it in minutes." Finally made. "Whatever happens in that room," he said softly, "I'm not going to face it the way I used to. Not with anger, Not with denial, and not with the delusion that power makes me invincible. Maggie nodded gently, her eyes reflecting a compassion he hadn't earned earlier, but now received without resistance, because redemption always began with humility, and humility required nothing more than acknowledging the cracks beneath the armor. She told him that clarity meant nothing unless it led to action, and that action meant recognizing the humanity of the people he led, not just the numbers they managed. Her voice, warm and steady, settled into him like a balm, soothing the raw edges of fear still clinging to his thoughts. For a moment, Evan simply looked at her, processing the strange comfort he found in her presence. A comfort that didn't elevate him, diminish him, or shield him, but grounded him in a reality he had forgotten how to live in. "If I get through this," he whispered, "I'd like to make amends for more than just tonight." His confession drifted into the soft light around them, carrying the sincerity of a man willing to rebuild, not because he wanted redemption in the eyes of others, but because he finally recognized the value of becoming someone he could respect when the noise faded. Maggie responded with a quiet smile, the kind that carried years of hard-won wisdom, and told him that real redemption didn't require grand gestures or public transformation, only the consistent choice to do better when it mattered most. Her words settled over him like a gentle reminder that his path forward would be neither easy nor glamorous, but profoundly meaningful if he allowed himself to grow from the humility he had discovered tonight. As the executives called him again, more urgently this time, Evan straightened his posture, but the change in him was unmistakable. His shoulders no longer bore the defensive rigidity of pride, and his steps no longer carried the sharp impatience of unchecked authority. Instead, he walked with a slower, steadier rhythm, as though he were finally moving in alignment with something honest inside him. Before entering the alcove, he turned back briefly, meeting Maggie's eyes with a look that conveyed gratitude deeper than words, a silent acknowledgement that she had given him something far more valuable than advice. She had reminded him of his own humanity. Maggie returned to her work with the gentle grace of someone who had never sought recognition, her movements smooth and unhurried as she collected empty plates and refilled glasses. The room, still buzzing softly with curiosity, watched her with newfound respect, though she remained unchanged, quiet, steady, and grounded in a strength that needed no applause. Outside the tall windows, the city lights shimmered against the night sky, reflecting the quiet truth that humanity, kindness, honesty, and resilience outlasted every hierarchy built on wealth or power. And as Maggie placed a clean tablecloth across a newly seated table, she felt a subtle warmth in her chest, not pride or triumph, but a calm contentment born from knowing she had stood firmly in her truth without losing herself. In that simple, steady moment, she understood that the night had not been about power, conflict, or even redemption alone. It had been about the enduring strength of the human heart, and the quiet miracle that occurs when dignity meets humility in the unlikeliest of places. The restaurant doors finally opened once more, and Evan stepped out not as the untouchable billionaire who had entered earlier that evening, but as a man shaped gently by truth, restored not by victory but by understanding. And though their paths would soon diverge into separate worlds, something profound lingered between them. A reminder that compassion, spoken with courage, could ripple more deeply than power ever could.